And we are back. We are making our way through. We got somebody coming in here. We're making our way through Dr. Peter Lillback's book, Wall of Misconception. That's the paperback version of it. And then it also comes in a hardback version as well. Today, we're on page 78 in the paperback. I think it's 72 in the hardback version, something like that. 72. So we're taking a look at the uh, Constitution how it came about, and today we're going to focus on the Bill of Rights. The Constitution sets forth the form of government for the nation, but not everyone was happy with the Constitution as it stood by itself. There was concern that um, more needed to be done to protect the liberties of the American people. And so we'll get into the Bill of Rights. I did want to take a moment to give you a little bit more of the context of things that are going from a Presbyterian perspective. And this is based on the work of Charles Hodge. The constitutional history of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. Hodge was a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary in the 1800s. Very great theologian. He's the author of a 3-volume systematic theology, which Rick read in total. So Rick gets 3 gold stars for his efforts, and the rest of us, we got to get going. But so Hodge is a terrific theologian, but he writes this constitutional history. I think it's in the mid-19th century. Let me see if I can get the publication date of the original. 1851? That can't be right. Maybe it is. 1851 is the date that I have here. So he talks about the context of what was going on. And his argument is that the American Revolution was not just about civil liberties or a rebellion against the Stamp Act and taxation without representation, all of those good things. It wasn't just about that, but religion was very much a part of the discussion here. And there were concerns that Great Britain was going to impose the state church on the colonies. And so in the American colonies, you had the Episcopal Church, which was kind of the American version of the Anglican Church. And there were fears that the British Parliament, the English Parliament, was going to impose the Episcopal Church as the national church here in the colonies. And so Hodge, in this book, page 396 of, I think it's about the third section of the book, third book here. In any case, Hodge quotes from a resolution passed by the House of Commons, that's in London, England, in February 1766. And this is what got a lot of the early American colonists upset, among other things. But it seemed to impose a tyrannical control over the colonies so that the English Parliament could make any decision whatsoever, and the colonies just had to abide by it. And so the resolution was that the King's Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal, and Commons of Great Britain, in Parliament assembled, hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America. subjects of the crown of Great Britain in all cases whatsoever. So the American colonies, particularly these folks who came to the Americas fleeing from the established church in England, who wanted to worship God freely according to their conscience. They were concerned that this was Parliament getting ready to impose uh, the establishment of the Episcopal Church. And so um, Hodge says that the Declaration of Independence for the American colonies was for all such a declaration of religious as well as of civil liberty. Now he'll go on to talk about um, how the American Revolution had its roots very much in the Presbyterian clergy. Now, by Presbyterian, at times the English were referring to everyone who is not an Anglican. So the Presbyterians would include Baptists and Congregationalists as well, just as a broad category. Uh, but they kind of viewed this as a rebellion of the Black Regiment, the Presbyterian clergy. And so one advocate of government by the name of Mr. Galloway ascribed in 1774 that the revolt and revolution mainly was given to the action of Presbyterian clergy and laity as early as 1764. One writer of that time period says, quote, you will have discovered that I am no friend to Presbyterians, and that I fix all the blame of these extraordinary American proceedings upon them. Hodge says, he goes on, believe, sir, the Presbyterians have been the chief and principal instruments in all these flaming measures, and they always do and ever will act against government from that restless and turbulent anti-monarchical spirit which has always distinguished them everywhere when they had or by any means could assume power, however illegally. And so there were those in English society that were blaming the American Revolution on the Presbyterians. And you can understand that in that the Presbyterians, along with Congregationalists and so forth, were dissenters from the Anglican establishment. They felt that this was an imposition on their freedom to worship God according to their own consciences. And so it was kind of understood that the Presbyterians would be naturally opposed to the imposition of an established church on the American colonies. And so it was. There was, however, as Hodge goes on to discuss this, there was an effort by the Synod of Philadelphia and New York, the Presbyterian Synod, to seek peace with England and to find reconciliation. There were declarations by the Synod that a certain day should be set aside for prayer and fasting in terms of the schism that was developing between the colonies and Great Britain. They were very concerned about that. They had a great deal of respect for the English and didn't want to be separate from them. They wanted to express their support for the British Empire. But it got to a point where they had to resist. And so you see that the American Civil War, the establishment of the American Revolution, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so forth, were in this religious context of conflict with the establishment of the Anglican or Episcopalian Church here in the colonies. And so that, I think, needs to be kept in mind when there's a discussion about the establishment of religion here in the United States. That was very much what was on the mind of the founding fathers from the very start. So uh, we looked last time at the arrangement of the Constitution and support from various folks to have that established here, and we discussed whether it was a Christian document. It seemed very much of a secular document, um, but Lillback points to this idea of the blessings of liberty, along with the end of the Constitution, describing it being written in the year of our Lord. And so it wasn't entirely secular in its approach. It's just dealing with mechanical things, if you will, on how the government should run. But now we look at the Bill of Rights, and I'll start reading with page 78 and follow along with Lillback's argument here. Of much debate surrounding the new Constitution, however, was the lack of a Bill of Rights. Having not yet forgotten the search for religious and civil freedom that had been the impetus for the Pilgrim journey in the first place, there were those who felt strongly that a Bill of Rights was essential to protect the citizens from the return of a tyrannical government. James Wilson and John Smiley debated the need for such a document in November 1787. James Wilson, as a signer of the Constitution, asserted that it was unnecessary because any power not expressly given to the government in the Constitution would be understood to be reserved for the people. John Smiley vehemently disagreed, noting that, quote, so loosely, so inaccurately are the powers which are enumerated in this Constitution defined that it will be impossible, without a test of that kind, to ascertain the limits of authority and to declare when government has degenerated into oppression. Sounds very much like what we've had over recent years, where people have twisted the Constitution to find liberties or laws embedded in there that were not really a part of the original intent of the Constitution, but rather reflected an activist judge or government seeking to advance its own authority and really lead to oppression and tyranny. At present, there is no security, even for the rights of conscience. And under the sweeping force of the sixth article, every principle of a Bill of Rights, every stipulation of the most sacred and invaluable privileges of man are left to the mercy of government. So at the very start, the American founding fathers were concerned to prevent tyranny and oppression, particularly the most profound tyranny, that over the conscience, what you believe about yourself and whether you worship God or not. And so there was a tremendous concern for this. And you can see the arguments going back and forth over whether a Bill of Rights was necessary or not. Lillback continues, further impetus for the crafting of a Bill of Rights was the existence of such a document in Virginia. James Madison's ideas of religious liberty had developed under Thomas Jefferson's significant influence. Jefferson's text for an act of establishing religious liberty, written some years earlier, was successfully brought to adoption under Madison's leadership in the Virginia legislature in 1786. This was only a year before the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and 5 years before the adoption of our First Amendment in 1791. Now, before we get into what Jefferson wrote for Virginia, there was a close relationship between Jefferson and Madison. They were both in Virginia, and they both served together. They were kind of opposites. Jefferson was 6'2", red hair, stood very straight. Madison was about 5'5", balding, blue-eyed. and rather shy. And yet, it would be Madison who really argued for this religious liberty and helped to get it passed there in Virginia. And so that passed just the year before the Bill of Rights was approved for the U.S. Constitution. So this was fresh on their minds as they brought it to the American colonies, to the United States of America at this point. And it's kind of interesting. Madison had a romantic relationship with a young woman there in Philadelphia, and Jefferson kind of encouraged him to become engaged and to propose marriage. And Madison did that, but he was rejected by the woman. And she returned back to New York City. And about 10 years later, Madison comes across a woman named Dolly, who he would marry and became rather famous as Dolly Madison. So Jefferson and Madison were very close friends. Jefferson's act declares, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do, that the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. Be it enacted by the General Assembly, this is down in Virginia again, that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. So this is Thomas Jefferson now, who's the author of this, who people say was a rationalist, who was not a Christian and so forth, and yet he does speak of Almighty God, so he wasn't an atheist. He believed in the existence of God. He speaks of this Almighty God as the holy author of our religion. What religion was he talking about? Well, Christianity. So this God is the Lord of both body and mind, and so you see Jefferson giving some details with regard to his understanding of theology, the existence of God, his lordship over all, and yet the fact that God, in his relationship to his creatures, does not impose his will on us in such a way that we are coerced to believe the gospel. It's not that the apostles went out with swords and conquered people like Islamists and forced them at the point of the sword to convert. That's not how the Christian faith has advanced. It's been through the preaching of the gospel, through persuasion, through argumentation, through reasoning, to help people come to faith in Christ. And this is the way that the gospel advances. So it's not advanced by force, but rather through persuasion. And Jefferson takes note of that and says that this is the way in which it should occur. And that method is abandoned by these politicians and uh, ecclesiasts, these clerics who want to impose their beliefs on everyone else by force, imposing a taxation on people to support the church. And then if they don't pay these taxes, they get to be in risk of being thrown into jail or what have you. And so um, Jefferson was opposed to that. You shouldn't be forced to support a particular church or even attend a particular church. You should be free um, to serve God or not to serve God according to your conscience. Now, note that Jefferson speaks of the unbelievers' right to express their opinions, to reason, and give their arguments for what they maintain, and they're free to do that in the United States. You're not limited in that regard. So you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. They go hand in hand. Um, so this is part of the only uh, uh, thing is you cannot hold to religious beliefs and then use them as um, an excuse for going around killing people and things like that. You still have to abide by the laws of uh, the country. So James Madison, with the aid of several others, also developed the language of the First Amendment. In a letter sent to James Madison on February 28th, 1788, entitled John Leyland's Objections to the Constitution Without a Bill of Rights, Reverend Leyland states, "What is clearest of all, religious liberty is not sufficiently secured. No religious test is required as a qualification to fill any office under the United States. But if a majority of Congress with the President favor one system more than another, they may oblige all others to pay to the support of their system as much as they please. And if oppression does not ensue, it will be owing to the mildness of administration and not to any constitutional defense. And if the manners of people are so far corrupted that they cannot live by republican principles, it is very dangerous leaving religious liberty at their mercy." So Reverend Leyland understood that the Constitution, as it stood, if you will, naked by itself alone, could nonetheless be abused by political and religious authorities in the future to impose a religious establishment. And so he did not feel that the present situation was appropriate, that they needed to do more than just say that or trust that the government will abide by the Constitution and not impose its will on people. So a Bill of Rights was required. Lillback writes, "A careful reading of the First Amendment shows us that the concern that motivated our founders was not to keep church and state separate, but to protect the conscience from governmental encroachments." You're going to see here an emphasis on the human conscience here with Lillback, and how important it is that that conscience be protected. And that's really what the uh, First Amendment is about. 20 iterations of the language for the First Amendment ensued in the congressional debate before the final version that we now know as the First Amendment was sent to the House on September 24th, 1789. And that final version is, as you're familiar with, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." It is worthy of note, Lillback writes, that not once in any of those 20 attempts to write the language of the First Amendment did the phrase separation of church and state appear. That's pretty significant. With all the hullabaloo currently about separation of church and state, the early American founders, when they were drafting the First Amendment, had no discussion about that whatsoever. It didn't show up at all in the drafts of this amendment, let alone in the final statement. It's not what they were intending to achieve. The word conscience, although it does not appear in the final form, occurs in 12 of these proposed iterations. Thus, it is evident that the motivating concern of the drafters of the First Amendment was to protect conscience from government, not to protect government from religion. Within 2 years, 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were approved, providing the foundation for the protection of the fundamental rights and liberties we now enjoy in America. So I underline that statement there by Lillback. The motivating concern of the drafters of the First Amendment was to protect conscience from government, not to protect government from religion. So it's protecting the people from the government, not the government from the people. That's really the focus and direction of the amendment here. And so the people were concerned about oppression and tyranny, tyranny, both civil and religious. And for that reason, they wanted to have this Bill of Rights that would further protect the liberties of the American people in their persons and their property. So that's where we come to the Bill of Rights with the First Amendment. Now, we'll go on to consider the metaphorical wall of separation between church and state that Thomas Jefferson wrote about here. And we're going to read what he had to say. Of course, this has been appealed to particularly by secularists and socialists who try to escape or reinterpret the Constitution. They say, well, Jefferson spoke of a wall of separation, and we want that to be a high wall of separation between church and state. And so this is the kind of language that you get many times in public discourse today. And it becomes a tool in the hands of those who are atheists, communists, socialists, to separate religion from public, from the government altogether, and make the government really an atheistic state. And you can have your religious beliefs, but you got to keep them private and off to the side. They're only something for you to express existentially within your own heart, in your own fellowship, in your own church, or what have you. But you cannot bring that stuff into the public sphere and require the government to respect those things. So we'll turn now to Jefferson's comment about a wall of separation between the church and state. Lillback says, in fact, the source for this idea of the separation of church and state is not the Constitution. In other words, that's the official document of the Americas. That's what we follow, not a private letter composed by a member of the Congress that wrote the Constitution. So the authority rests with the Constitution, not with a private letter. The private letter only illumines perhaps the thinking of one member of the Congress. In any case, it's not from the Constitution, but a private letter of Thomas Jefferson. Sadly, the use of this letter is also historically incorrect. The focus of Jefferson's letter was also protecting the conscience, which is what we've seen was behind the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. This focus of protecting the conscience is also seen when Jefferson's famous language of the wall of separation between church and state is quoted in context. Again, context is so important, whether it's in studying the scriptures or in other matters. What often happens is that somebody takes something, separates it from its context, and uses it, gives it a different understanding or interpretation than it was intended originally. And that's where you get into trouble, where you just pick and choose certain things to fit a narrative that really the statement was not intended to support. So in his letter to a committee of the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut, drafted on January 1st, 1802, this is some years after the Congress met, Jefferson declared, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, adhering to the expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience. I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has not natural right in opposition to his social duties." So this wall of separation that Jefferson notes is on behalf of the rights of conscience, to preserve the individual's rights to worship God as he pleases or not, to give expression to his opinions in speech, or to oppose different points of view. That all that is protected by the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Lillback comments on this by saying, religious liberty in its basic form was completed in America after various historic denominations rewrote their creeds and forms of governments so that they would reflect the American federal constitutional system of the non-establishment yet free exercise of religion. Let me just take a moment to look at the footnote here on the back. Yeah. In the back of the book, there's a footnote on this, which I thought was interesting and helpful. He writes, as an example of a church that changed its creed in the context of the American experience of religious liberty, note the striking difference in understanding of the relationship of church and state between the original version of the Presbyterian Westminster Confession of Faith, which was published in around 1644 in London, England, the Presbyterian Westminster Confession of Faith, and the altered American text. The original version of 1647 affirms that the magistrate ought to have the coercive power in religious matters. So the Presbyterian Confession in 1647 does recognize an intrusive role of the government in the exercise of religion and religious rights. And so Lillback quotes the confession in this regard, and I'll read it for you since we're Presbyterians and we should know a little bit about our history here. The original Westminster Confession said, "The civil magistrate may not assume to himself the administration of the word and sacraments or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Yet he hath authority, and it is his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and all the ordinances of God duly settled, administered, and observed. For the better effecting whereof, he hath power to call synods, to be present at them, and to provide that whatsoever is transacted in them be according to the mind of God. So the civil authority has quite a task in front, basically protecting the church from heresies, establishing the peace of the church, suppressing heresies. That's the state does that with imprisonments, taxes, penalties, perhaps even executions. And so the Presbyterian church at the time was amenable to that. And that kind of reflects the culture of the day and the way people thought of the government and its role. But Lillback writes, under the leadership of John Witherspoon, the president of Princeton, at that time a conservative Presbyterian college, and the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Presbyterian Church in the United States amended its confession. The American edition of the confession, thus adopted in 1789, recognized a clear distinction between the power of the state and the power of the church, noting that the government should protect all faiths, not just one established religion. Chapter 23, Section 3 states, civil magistrates may not assume to themselves the administration of the word and sacraments, or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. That's what we've read in the original one as well. Or in the least, interfere in matters of faith. Yet, as nursing fathers, it is the duty of civil magistrates to protect the church of our common Lord without giving the preference to any denomination of Christians above the rest, in such a manner that all ecclesiastical persons whatsoever shall enjoy the full, free, and unquestioned liberty of discharging every part of their sacred functions without violence or danger. And as Jesus Christ hath appointed a regular government and discipline in his church, no law of any commonwealth shall interfere with, let, or hinder the due exercise thereof among the voluntary members of any denomination of Christians, according to their own profession and belief. It is the duty of civil magistrates to protect the person and good name of all their people in such an effectual manner as that no person be suffered, either upon pretense of religion or infidelity, to offer any indignity, violence, abuse, or injury to any other person whatsoever, and to take order that all religious and ecclesiastical assemblies be held without molestation or disturbance. I believe that's very much what we have today in our confession of faith as well. So, okay, thank you. So that has continued to this very day, a recognition that the government is not to interfere with the affairs of the church or to distinguish between one church, one denomination and the next and to favor one over the other. It's to kind of have a if you will, a blind eye to those distinctions and allow the church to handle these kinds of things. Okay. We're on the top of page 82, middle of the paragraph there. All the state churches, including those of New England, were ultimately disestablished to conform to the freedom of religion on the federal level. Many state constitutions explicitly include the language to protect the rights of conscience. Again, you have another footnote, number 66, which is also extensive. It does point to the Pennsylvania Constitution, which was adjusted accordingly. I won't read through all that because that'll get us beyond the time that we have. But Many of the states had established churches within them. The Congregationalist churches up in New England, the Anglican churches in the South, Virginia, South Carolina, and so forth. And so um, the federal government was not going to have an established church, but then you had the states having established churches within the states. And they also then began to adjust so that they reflected the national pattern where the state did not allow an established church within its domain. So that was also a good thing. It is ironic that the language of separation between church and state, although not appearing in the First Amendment of our U.S. Constitution, was included in the Constitution of the former USSR. Interesting. Um, quoting from that Constitution, in order to ensure to citizens the freedom of conscience, the church in the USSR is separated from the state and the school from the church. Freedom of religious worship and freedom of anti-religious propaganda is recognized for all citizens. How well did that go in the Soviet Union? They came around and they rounded up priests and pastors, shot them, executed them, put them in prison, all these kinds of things. Believers would also be persecuted. They would have spies come into their assemblies and observe what was going on and then report them to the government and all kinds of things like that. But they had in their constitution a separation between church and state. I guess if it's like what happened in China recently, where one of the pastors spoke out against the president, I think Xi Jinping, and suddenly had people knocking on his door, and he ended up going to prison for, I think, a few years. I believe he's been released now. But so much for their freedom of religion. It is, the result of misreading the Jeffersonian metaphor of separation of church and state into our First Amendment has been the granting of expansive powers to our courts. Accordingly, our courts have lost the historic First Amendment's focus on conscience. The immediate result? The courts, like the Ninth Circuit, that's out in the California area, declare that it is unconstitutional to teach in a public setting, even if it is in the Declaration, that a nation only has certain unalienable rights if it has been so endowed by God the Creator. Similarly, some are forbidden to say God's name when they pledge their allegiance to our nation, even if their consciences permit them to agree with this act established by our own Congress in accord with our national heritage. So Lillback notes the consequences of this enforcement of separation of church and state is really driving out any religious expression within a public setting. To forbid speaking of God certainly protects the consciences of atheists. Does it protect the free speech and the consciences of theists? The historic pattern protected the rights of atheists as well, for their free speech has also been honored. The historic American understanding of First Amendment liberties was well explained in 1876 by theologian Charles Hodge. Quote, in the process of time, thousands have come among us who are neither Protestants nor Christians. All are welcomed. All are admitted to equal rights and privileges. All are allowed to worship as they please, or not to worship at all if they see fit. No man is molested for his religion or for his want of religion. That is, its lack of religion. No man is required to profess any form of faith or to join any religious association. More than this cannot reasonably be demanded. More, however, is demanded The infidel demands that the government should be conducted on the principle that Christianity is false. This is, again, Charles Hodge, 1876. The atheist demands that it should be conducted on the assumption that there is no God, and the positivist on the principle that men are not free agents. The sufficient answer to all this is that it cannot possibly be done. Imagine back in the 1800s, the same kinds of things being fought over as we have today, where atheists stand up and demand that the government suppress religious expression. Lillback quotes John Locke in a letter concerning toleration. The care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate any more than to other men. It is not committed unto him, I say, but God, because it appears not that God has ever given any such authority to one man over another as to compel anyone to his religion. Because it appears not that God has ever given any such authority over one man over another as to compel anyone to his religion. So that finishes up our look at the wall of separation between church and state. Next time, as we get together, we'll continue and look at the blending of church and state and the cooperation of church and state, different ways of looking at the relationship between church and state. So we'll finish there. I don't have more comments to make, I don't think. I could, I did some, what time is it? It's after 10. I'll save this for another time, but one of my former professors, indeed my faculty advisor at Westminster Seminary years ago, not too long ago, Dr. Tremper Longman wrote a book on the Bible and the ballot, and he has a chapter on religious liberty. And he has some good points to make in the course of that, but I think there are some other things that need to be qualified. Maybe we can get to that at another time. So I'll just put that aside for now. We'll say farewell to those who are watching online and hope you're doing well, and invite you to join our channel, the First Orthodox Presbyterian Church of Perkasie, not only for this Bible study from week to week, but also our worship services on Sunday mornings. And we certainly invite you to come out to our church for a worship service. We're located on the corner of 5th and Ray Streets in Perkasie. Our services are at 9:30 in the morning. God bless and take care.